And I want to welcome you. Amelia said it, and we mean it. You are welcome. Whether you're a member, a non-member from all over the world, you're welcome to join us in this initiative. I have personally been doing racial justice work for years, and I want to thank my partner in that, Dawn Knight Thomas. I know that I wouldn't be where I am today without her and the partnership that I've had with her for years, and she is one of those core BIPOC people working on this initiative with us, along with the facilitators you'll meet tonight, who've been there since the beginning. I want to give you a little history of this initiative. Amelia has let you know the work that we've done, but this all originated from our student board member, our MSW representative, who identifies as a Muslim woman. And she contacted us in July and was just really disheartened by a lot of things she was seeing. And she said, we've got to do something. Like, we've got to have change. This isn't okay. And we ended up having about a 2-hour conversation. Within that 2 hours, the revolution was born, and we had it mapped out. That was the second week in July. We scheduled the first revolution for the 4th week in July. And in the 3rd week in July, we met with BIPOC social workers from across New York State to roll it out to them and get their feedback and to know, hey, is this something you want to be involved with? Is this something you'd want to work on? All of that. And we got their approval and we were off and running. We did not dream that this would go as big as it did. And we are thrilled because the most important thing is change. We have to change. We can't change anything until we admit and talk about systemic and structural racism. And we need everyone to create that change. So this initiative, like Amelia said, is led by BIPOC social workers. Every part of it is led by BIPOC social workers. When we say BIPOC, we mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That's who we're talking about. And again, I just want to reiterate that this space tonight is for BIPOC voices. So if you have white privilege or you identify as white, please support people through the chat feature. You can message people from the chat feature, but we ask that you don't speak, because this is a space for BIPOC voices to discuss what's going on and what they've experienced in social work practice. Out of this initiative, we've really creating a community, and we've already started to see change from the revolution. We've heard from several people who have joined us for these that they're speaking up in ways they haven't, just because they've been validated. I think that's one of the most insidious things about racism, is when people think that they're the only one it's happening to. And this space is created, was created for people to be like, no, this has happened to me. And every time we have one of these, we're fascinated that someone will talk about an experience and we have 20 people in the chat say, that happened to me, that happened to me. And immediately that person feels validated and feels the strength to speak out on it the next time it happens to them. So this community is powerful. We're already seeing the change. And of course, we're going to keep working toward the change. And I did see a question right before I started talking. Is this going to go out nationwide, like our goals? And like how we move forward. Everything we do will be published. So every paper that we have to be disseminated will be on our website so that other states can use this, because we're all after the same thing, which is change. We need racial equity. We've never been a racially equitable country, and now is the time. So yes, we will share everything because we all have the same goal. So I'm not going to talk anymore, and I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful facilitators, Cecily Mitchell Harper and Caroline Brown.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. This is one of the largest registrations NASW in New York chapter has seen, and to see all the people globally, not just around this nation, but globally, is so exciting. It's a testament to you, your passion, your voice, your experience, our collective skill, knowledge, practice as BIPOC social workers and allies. We see you. We are happy to have you here tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Caroline Brown. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in New York State. My parents immigrated to London, United Kingdom, from Trinidad and Guyana in the 60s. And I was born in London, and I immigrated to New York 20 years ago. As a new immigrant, my children and I have been recipient of social services. And as a provider, I have worked in child welfare, outpatient mental health, substance abuse, healthcare in Westchester County, and 2 surrounding counties in New York State. So I'm going to hand it over to Cecily for her introduction.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I just want to second what Caroline said. I am so honored and so humbled, quite honestly, to be here, to be part of this movement, and the fact that folks are here from all over the world. Like, I'm blown away by that. And so I just want to say that, just second what Caroline said. Thank you so much for being here. I am so grateful to be here. I am Cecily Mitchell Harper. I am a facilitator, a coach, a strategic advisor. I've been doing a number of these town halls and have just been so blown away by where it's going, where we've come from and where we're going. I was born in Sierra Leone, West Africa. I came to the United States when I was 2 years old, and I have lived in the US ever since. Lived in New York primarily, grew up in New York, and then lived in Philadelphia for many, many years. And now I'm back in New York. And I have worked in numerous social work practice settings, including schools, including human service, mental health, outpatient organizations, as well as technical assistance organizations, research centers. I have seen it, and I have been in many different practice areas. So I'm, again, really, really grateful and honored to be here. So as Amelia said in the beginning, we have had a series of and also Sam mentioned in the beginning, we've had a series of town halls, and the previous town halls that we participated in have been related to social work education. So we're looking at racism within social work education. And that was a really deep, powerful dialogue around how racism shows up in social work education settings, including classes and in field placement. And from that, the richness that came out of those sessions emerged really specific goals for change that I believe is really moving us towards transformational change. And again, so honored to be part of the journey. Now, this session, we're going to turn our focus from discussion of what happens, as social work students to what happens when we graduate, as we transition from being a social work student to a social work practitioner. And again, we're going to be uplifting the voices of BIPOC social workers practicing, and you can speak from if you're a student, you can speak from a field placement experience. Some of these questions will be relevant to that, as well as if you're a seasoned practitioner, you've been working for 25, 30 years. We want to hear from you as well. And so that, thankfully, we're going to have time for this session. And then we're also going to be doing a follow-up session in January. As Amelia said, I'm sure that we will be having more sessions as we go into 2021 related to this topic, because there's so much, and I'm sure that so much is going to come from this conversation even this evening. So this is just part one of social racism within social work practice, clinical practice. Before we begin, I want to be mindful of this conversation. This conversation can be hard, can be challenging, can be difficult. And as we start engaging in a dialogue, particularly as it relates to race, racism, our own personal experiences, there's feelings that come up with that. And so I want to take a moment where we can just get in touch with ourselves, how we're showing up in this space, and how we want to be in this dialogue together. And so I would encourage you to take some time out now. You can actually put yourself off screen if you want, just for a few seconds, take a few moments to create an intention for yourself for how you want to be in this space this evening. And so for an example, that can be, I want to be curious. I want to lean into discomfort. For me, my intention is I want to listen deeply. So I encourage you to just take a few moments. You can write it down. You can just say it to yourself. We're not going to share it out, but just say it to yourself, write it down, just an intention for how you want to be in this space this evening. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, this can be a challenging topic. So I do encourage you, as you're going through this dialogue, if you're starting to have feelings, sometimes when I'm going through these dialogues, I have a range of emotions. And so I encourage you to be aware of what comes up for you, to lean into that discomfort if you're able to, but also to know when you need to take a step out and a step back. And that's okay. You can take yourself off camera. You don't have to speak. And you don't have to speak at all if you don't want to. You can share in the chat, or you can speak if you want to. But I do encourage you, if you feel like you're getting triggered, if you feel like, you know what, this is too much, take a step back, ground yourself, remind yourself of your intention, do deep breathing, whatever works for you, or just take a step away. That's totally fine. Just want to acknowledge that as we go into this conversation. And so now we're going to go into the conversation. And again, I actually want to stop talking because we want to hear from you. So the first question, and we just have a series of prompts, but this conversation is really free flowing. So, you know, we'll just kind of go with where folks are. And as I said, we want to hear from you. So the first question is, if you can think about how do the institutional organizational settings that we practice within perpetuate institutional and systemic racism? So we're going to think about how the institutional organizational settings that we practice within perpetuate institutional and systemic racism. Now, you can speak from, if you're a social worker who's been in the field for 30 plus years, or if you're just starting out, or if you're a student in a field placement and you're seeing things, please speak from whatever experience. We can think about policies that harm Black and Brown clients. Think about narratives that we hear about Black and Brown clients. Oh, their parents are this. Oh, there's, you know, these children are that. Anything, we're leaving it very open, very broad. Please share your experiences. We want to hear from you. As we go through this, we're actually taking notes so that we can be thinking about goals and objectives for how we want to move this change forward.
And I want us to keep in mind that American psychiatry was founded on the principles of European medicine. And so that the medical model is very much, you know, the gold standard. So, you know, keep that in mind, you know, as you're thinking about examples of how in your settings you have seen the perpetuation of systemic racism.
I also see that Nazira's hand is up. Nazira, if you wanted to speak, you can feel free. Okay. So not sure what's happening with Nazira, but I'm seeing also a lot of things come up in the chat. So definitely feel free to utilize the chat, but also feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, unmute yourself, and speak as to your experience. Yes, Jenny.
Okay, hello everyone. I am thank you for this opportunity. I will attempt as a social worker to make this brief and concise. That's a miracle if I can do that. I have had at least 17 years of experience either in child welfare, public health, even the prison system, kind of combined 20 plus years. So I've worked in a number of institutions. And I believe that what I saw was definitely across the board a lack of recruitment for social workers of color or Black and brown social workers that were often able to probably represent clients from a cultural background. Even when we would try to encourage going out and getting certain interns, we were not really given interns that would represent the demographic of clients. And while I did think that we needed to broaden our recruitment efforts were not usually supported. Although myself and maybe other social workers would push that, it was never really supported. I basically worked for state agencies in the areas where I worked. So if you know what happens in the state bureaucracies, it's really hard to make an impact when you're not in that demographic, when you're not in the administrative levels. So we would often get ignored, and we would often say that what would happen is that a lot of times our clients were not successful because they did not feel like they were being supported in case plans and things of that nature. And so that would often be dismissed as though the clients just did not care about their children. So it was really hard to invoke the cultural element into case plans. And it was really difficult to get administration to look at that factor. It was not until later, as I began to exit those, some of those agencies, that started to become more recognized, that we needed to recruit, and we needed to recruit African Americans. We needed to recruit Hispanics. We needed to recruit Muslims. We needed to recruit individuals from diverse backgrounds other than the ones who were basically already linked in, to the system because of family and just the area, and they would automatically get the jobs and those sort of things. So.
Thank you, Jenny. I mean, you're pointing to the fact that, people of color are expected to assimilate into a white culture, and you're talking about the gaps in service delivery. And so thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much also, Jenny, for speaking to that. And I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, that doesn't just happen, within the child welfare system. This is in so many different areas of practice, right? And so this, unfortunately, is a trend. This is a trend that we were actually talking about when we were talking about social work education. And now we're seeing it here again. And I also wanted to highlight that in the chat, Keisha mentioned a lack of recruitment, lack of diversity, where we have, mainly in management positions, especially when you get to top leadership positions, it tends to be mainly white and male. And then when you get to, a lot of the clients tend to be, Black and brown clients. So again, looking at that disconnect, and it has implications, right? So what you just spoke to, Jenny, thank you so much for speaking to that, because it does have very clear implications for practice, and also clear implications for, BIPOC social work practitioners. Anybody else want to speak to that? And also I encourage you, I've seen so many things come up in the chat. If anything comes up in the chat that you've mentioned that you want to, highlight and speak out, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and speak out as well. We just want to hear from you.
I had raised my hand. I am from a rural area in Ohio, So what I have experienced is, number one, I am one of two persons of color in my entire organization. So we are serving more persons of color in my area, but they don't have a lot of representation. So when I came along, it was like, oh, I didn't think they hired people like you, which is a problem. But then within that time frame, I've always worked in management, and getting my degree in social work and coming in there with my knowledge of community-based services, going through that myself, I found that I was not being mentored for leadership roles. And when I showed that interest in leadership roles, I was told, oh, you had a late case note, or you didn't do this correctly. When I know for a fact that I never missed a visit, never did anything wrong in my job, of course, overperforming, because that is what we are taught as Black individuals as well as persons of color, because you always have to overperform to be seen for half the credit. And so going there and asking, what do I need to do? And then getting it to the point of perfection, when all that was left is keep up the work. But then knowing that someone was given the job over me who was not prepared for that job, people leaving the supervisory positions because it was too hard on them, but knowing that I could handle that because of my upbringing, because of my culture and my background of being able to do that. And so that is what is disappointing, is because your voice isn't heard and you're not wanting to speak out. I had people going to my desk and finding things and going to HR. So that immediately put me on the list of a troublemaker, but I didn't do anything. Someone saw socks. Oh, she has some socks on her desk. Well, you had to go in my area and look under my desk. So right there, I was not defended, I was scrutinized. And I was told to change what I was doing. My desk was moved because I was being, discriminated against and mistreated. And so who suffered for that but myself? Those people had no repercussion. And so I feel like if an organization is going to hire social workers, they need to be ready for persons of color to represent all cultures and all people, as well as defend them outside of work as well as in the workplace with their colleagues.
Stephanie, thank you so much for speaking to that. Thank you for sharing your experience. Unfortunately, again, I've heard so many stories like that. I've experienced that personally. And it speaks to what you're speaking to is, it's not just about hiring more staff of color, right? Sometimes we can hire more staff of color, but if the organization, as you just said, is not ready for that, then staff of color are going to be passed over for, opportunities for further advancement, opportunities for leadership positions. And so you're really speaking to, okay, it's not just we need to have more diversity, it's how do we actually set up our systems? How do we actually set up our organizations to truly support and mentor and groom staff of color to be able to be in positions that they quite rightly deserve? So thank you for speaking to that. I also want to see another Stephanie S.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. I saw your hand. I wanted to get to you.
No worries. I don't know if this is to the prompt, but some of the things I've experienced is I primarily work with adolescents and young children. And I constantly see Black and Latino children's, talked about as criminals and their behavioral disorders and their ODD and just pathologizing everything about these children, right? But on the other hand, when it comes to a Caucasian client or a Caucasian child, it's like, oh no, it's depression, it's anxiety. And so that's something that I've really been struggling with, because when I look at these children of color, I'm seeing that they're growing up in poverty, they're experiencing not all of them, but the majority in my community that I'm working with, they're experiencing poverty, community violence on top of racial oppression, right? So I'm saying, to me, when I see the whole picture, I see this as a normal trauma response, right, to their environment. But then I'll have other people say, no, that's ODD, they're a criminal, there's something wrong with them. And so that's something that I've been trying to advocate for, and I've been seeing, you know, throughout my work there. And then also I wanted to bring up that another way, I just saw this on LinkedIn about, you know, there was research about student loan debt and how social workers of color have significantly higher student loan debt than Caucasian social workers. So those are just some of the things. Also in the chat, someone said something I really resonated with, how white leadership wouldn't say Black Lives Matter, but other companies for profit would. And that's something that I really stood up for, because like in our windows at my job, we put save lives, stay home. But when we constantly kept seeing this police brutality, no one would say Black Lives Matter because they didn't want to affiliate with a potential corporation or something. And so we had to censor ourselves, and we had to advocate for Black and people of color, but without saying the Black. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. You know, that defeats the purpose. So those are just some of the things that I've been experiencing.
Thank you, Stephanie, for saying that, because it's almost like talking about, you know, Black lives and racism is almost like a taboo. It's almost like it just cannot be, you know, mentioned. And so thank you. I see a couple of other hands that are up. I see Monica Adams.
Let me unmute myself here.
Okay.
I guess I kind of want to piggyback on what Stephanie was ending with as I think about institutional organizational racism in the social work profession. I feel like there is a disconnect between the organizations and the message and the individual people who make up the profession of social work. Meaning we have this awesome New York chapter that's having this conversation about racism. You have other chapters across the country who have Black Lives Matters on their Facebook pages, on their websites, etc. But then you have the members of those chapters. I feel like there is a disconnect when I think about the lack of support for myself as a person of color by my white social work peers is very disappointing. And their silence is almost heartbreaking, because, you know, in the field of social work, we develop friendships at work. We're not like corporate America or other jobs. We become friends with our coworkers because we have empathy for each other. We support each other when a loved one dies or you're sick or whatever. But when it comes to that issue of racism, I have silence from my white peers. When I come to work frustrated because I've watched the protest on TV or I watched George Floyd be killed, and I want to vent and talk about this in a place that should be safe because I'm around social workers, I get silence, or I get the empathetic smile and nod, but there's no dialogue. But let me come to work and say, oh, I passed this poor homeless man on the street and somebody was beating him up. Then there's this 3-hour rant about that. Or if I bring up something maybe about, you know, gay rights or something like that, or the elderly. But when it comes to racism, there's this silence among my white peers. And it's very frustrating because at the end of the day, I feel like as social workers, we came about to fight social injustice, to create justice, to combat poverty, child abuse, and all those things. But so many of the social ills that we are fighting stem back to racism and oppression. So we're not ever willing to go to battle and fight those things. None of those other little things we're trying to fight are ever going to go away or change because the root issue remains there. And I don't know how to help my white peers see it's time for you to speak up and stop being silent. The time has passed to stay silent or sit on the fence. If you're going to be a social worker, then it's the whole ethics, it's the whole competencies. It's not just the ones that make you feel good and that you're comfortable with addressing.
Monica, I couldn't have said it any better myself. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head right there. I mean, it was, yeah, I mean, you've really given it in a whole nutshell. I mean, you've really kind of you unpacked it and just, wrapped it up so well. Yeah,
Yes.
that is the
Yes.
crux of the issue that we as Black social workers are experiencing. I liken it to being like seen, but not seen. So you're kind of visible, but then invisible, like your pain or the pain of Black people, Black and brown people is invisible, but it's so visible.
Yeah, absolutely. When the issue is hair, music, any of those things, then my Blackness is celebrated. But if I come to work angry because I'm a Black person in America, then I'm invisible. We don't want to talk about that side of your Blackness, but you can bring all the other Blackness, but not that.
Mm-hmm. Monica, thank you. Thank you for speaking to that. I just
Could I speak?
there was something that came up in the chat that just resonated with me. Somebody said, white silence is violence. That is like I wish I could go back and see who said that, but regardless, like that is true. White silence is violence. And I think I just get into a conversation with folks around, back when George Floyd happened and how institutions and social work practice institutions and organizations, how they manage that, and how Black and brown social workers were expected, myself included, to continue to show up, come to work, and not speak about that as if that's not happening. I'm just going to ignore this, even though this is right on my news, even though I'm seeing it on my newsfeed, even though it's right in front of my face, even though my husband, I know, could be one of those people. And so that it's hard, and it's traumatic. It's trauma. We talk about trauma and trauma-informed practice, but we're going through that trauma ourselves. And so thank you so much. This forum is to highlight that. This forum is to bring out and uplift these voices that sometimes are, many times, we can't talk about. We're not going to go there. We're going to keep that silent, and we hold on to it. And that emotional labor and that emotional burden that creates, it's trauma in and of itself. In a profession that purports to be about social justice and racial justice and racial equity. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add that my director is a Black male, and the day after, or when I came to work, we were in a staff meeting and no one said anything. And I'm like, okay, I have to stop this meeting. Is no one going to talk about what's happened? And then my boss, he starts looking, concerned because he knows what I'm getting ready to say. And I just want to say that it doesn't just happen under white leadership. It also happens under Black leadership.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this forum, and thank everyone for your comments. My name is Dolores, and I'm from New York, and I've been in social work for over 30 years. And when I got into social work, I felt like I was doing God's work, and this was what I was supposed to be doing. And I'm going to be around like-minded people, and we're going to be helping people. And I was so, so disappointed when I found out when I was in school, that my fellow students were racist. And the professors weren't saying anything. They weren't challenging it. And that was very disheartening. But I still didn't have the voice. I didn't have the experience. I wasn't brave enough to say anything. So I kind of swallowed it and went through. And everything everyone said, as when I went into different professions, I found that the hierarchy was white and was male, but all the clients were people of color. And it seems so disconnected. So now being here so long, I'm able to ask, why do you do this work? That's my question. Why are you doing this work? Because if you're not looking at why you're doing it and you're doing more harm, then what, is that intentional? We really have an opportunity now to really stop and ask that question. So that was just what I wanted to put out there. And I do feel more empowered now. I am in a position where I'm in management now. So I am able to kind of look with that eye and be able to ask those questions when I do see that people are treated unfairly, or we're judging people and we're not helping and we're hurting. So I'm able to kind of stop someone and say, why are you doing this? You know, what's your goal? What's your purpose? Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. We're here to amplify your voice. For those who are not sure about racism, I just want to say that racism is about power and privilege, conscious or or implicit. The result is to disadvantage one group over another, and so we have to kind of like understand what these definitions are in order to understand what the root of the problem is. So thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing, Dolores.
Thank you. Thank you, Dolores, as well. And I just want to go back to something that Darlene said, and I think it speaks to your point, is that, racism is embedded in our institutions, right? And because of that, so even though there may be Black leadership, I've seen this, a Black CEO who's still behaving in a way and actions and attitudes that suggest, oh, wow, oh, that kind of hurts. It happens because it's not just about who's in that. Sometimes we think, oh, well, if we just have more people of color, then that will help. No, it's embedded in these systems and institutions. It's embedded in these structures. It's interpersonal, yet it's also embedded. And so our job, all of us, we all have a role to play, is to be able to disrupt those patterns. And part of these forums is to be able to speak what's going on, right? For voices that traditionally have been silenced. And so this is that space to be able to start to disrupt. We can't change what we cannot see, what we don't acknowledge. And so we're starting the disruption. And this is all about that. So thank you so much, everyone who's speaking to this. So it's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. So
I'd like to share.
Yes.
So I work in an Indigenous community, and for me, it shows up in seeing white leadership, just like many other people have shared. And when I look at that, I also see like the absence of the discussion of race and how racism impacts the people that we serve. And I also look at my peers, and I look at different people, and I think of how differently our organization would be led if it was led by an Indigenous person, because so much of our work is filtered through a white lens and done in a way from a dominant culture. And I also see it show up with the standards for hiring. We have a higher level of standard at my agency. I'm actually the only social worker at my agency, but our hiring credentials, it's higher than what's typically expected. So then that automatically rules out people of the population that we serve, because it's known that in the community we serve, there's a small percentage of people who have college degrees. And that's another way that it shows up when we favor education through a white lens, like college degrees, because there's other ways of knowing, there's other ways of having knowledge, and there's other ways of having experience, which has been erased in Indigenous communities. There's been so much work in the last 100+ years of erasing those types of knowledge systems and replacing it with dominant culture. Oh, and then I also see it in schools of social work, where I get invited on the week, they're discussing Indigenous social work, but truly it should be embedded through every aspect. And we shouldn't have a guest speaker on a different topic for a different week. Like, just like today, those voices should be amplified all the time.
When I would go to visit my mother in Yonkers,
Jessica, thank you so much. Thank you for highlighting what's happening in Indigenous communities. And one thing that you're speaking to is something that, you know, comes up a lot in terms of whose voices are privileged, whose knowledge, right? What knowledge is being privileged? What knowledge, whose voices are being centered? And within social work education, as you spoke to, within social work practice, we're seeing it, that it's a white paradigm. It's based on a white Eurocentric paradigm. That's how social work was started in this country. And so we have to acknowledge that foundation, and this is how it continues to play out. So just thank you for speaking to that, particularly about what's happening within Indigenous, Indigenous communities. Thank you. I also want to say, I see Eddie and Brianna had their hand up. So I want to invite Eddie or Brianna, if you want to speak, please feel free. I did see your hand.
Sure, I'll jump in. So I joined late. I just got out of class. It ended early, so I was happy to be able to jump in. But I know so I go to a CUNY school here in New York City, and we actually did a lot of organizing to push our social work department to include a mandatory core curriculum class on anti-racist ideology education within social work. And the reason why is because what we've noticed is, because our institution is predominantly Indigenous, Black, brown, and people of color, there's a lot of what I call false, if we're thinking about the pedagogy of our practice, there's a lot of false diversity where we're seeing, oh, we have a lot of Latin people, we have a lot of Indigenous people, but when we get to how they present, phenotypically, they're all white or as close to whiteness as possible. And so I think that in these kind of conversations, we really have to expand the conversation, understanding what whiteness is, what Blackness is, and how that standard, regardless of what profession you're in, is used to uphold whiteness and what the status quo is. And I know one thing that I have been really pushing our department to take a stance on is really saying, we are prioritizing Black liberation over white comfort, because that is what's happening in the classroom. Is far too many students who are experiencing aggressions. I don't like the term microaggression or subconscious bias, because racism is racism. I think we have to stop sugarcoating language for white comfort and really just call it what it is, and really just say that this is what's going on. And we can't also allow, our white counterparts who may not have been doing the modern day grassroots anti-racist work to co-opt the movement. Because what I saw happen in a lot of our conversations was, some of our white professors saying, well, I experience racism in this way. And it's like, no, sweetheart, you don't, because you're white. And if that makes you so uncomfortable, then you got to go back into yourself and process those feelings, because it's not our community's burden to bear that you feel uncomfortable being addressed in your discomfort. And so, I think as we continue to have these conversations, it really spans over every aspect of our social work practice, from diagnosing to the interventions that we're given, to even the small things of the case client examples used in class. I've noticed that a lot of times the ideologies that we're taught are from a white Eurocentric perspective, but they project it onto Black and Indigenous people and expect for our cultural, norms to be utilized and seen through this lens, and it doesn't work. And what do? We give, Black boys all these disorders that don't necessarily apply. We're not thinking about a trauma-centered approach. So that's just my little thing, but we got to talk about whiteness. We have to, because no matter what realm we go into, that's always the term that's like under the radar. Nobody wants to talk about it because it makes, not even white presenting, I'm getting rid of that language. It makes white people of color feel like they're not invited into the conversation. But at the same time, it's like, not all people of color have Black struggles, and, you know, understanding your proximity to whiteness to that has to be viewed, because it's not, you know, it's not discrimination. You just got like diversity blues. You're not Black enough to fit in here. You're not white enough to fit in there. So where do I fit in? And then you're taking up so much space that we're aiding into the anti-Blackness, even by using just the term people of color. When we say people of color, a lot of times it erases Black people from the conversation. So we got to just be like cognizant of that too.
Eddie, oh my gosh, just thank you. Eddie, I have heard you've been on so many of these town halls, and I always love hearing what you have to say, because you just speak it. I mean, you just speak truth. And I just want to say, and then I have other people that I know have raised their hands. I also am tired of microaggressions being labeled as microaggressions, because it downplays and it minimizes the actual experience, right? These are not microaggressions, these are aggressions. Let's call them racial aggressions. Let's call them what it is. So thank you for speaking to that. I know some other people mentioned that in the chat as well. I also see, so Brianna had her hand up, and Notion, and I think a couple of other people. So yeah, we just definitely, if you did have your hand up, please feel free. Brianna and Notion, and
I'll jump in.
yes.
So I'm actually in the state of Virginia, and a lot of my experience is with, you know, juvenile justice, working with adolescents, residential facilities, as well as child welfare, particularly foster care. And of course, they're very intertwined, but for the purpose of this, what the point I'm going to make, I'll just keep them separate. While I was working in residential, I saw way too many times how the white youth that were in residential got treated. They would assault staff. You would be called racial slurs. Their behaviors, of course, you know, mixture of trauma, but also a lot of other things were just downplayed often. And it's just like, you know, the word trauma was thrown at us. Well, do this, do that. Whereas with my Black youth, my Black boys particularly, because a lot of them came from the juvenile justice, they came from detention. They were there on a diversion program. And so when they would come in, they would only have one chance. If they messed up one time, they were sent right back to the detention center. And there was an incident of just a young boy, he had an outburst because he got bad news, and that showed up through his aggression. And one of the therapists, who was a white woman, claimed that he tried to attack and hit her. And I'm like, well, where's this energy when client A, who is a white boy, has attacked and hit you, but it's just, you know, swept under the rug. But now you're ready to send him right back to the detention center. Whereas it's just a lot of issues and inequity in that regard. And also just in child welfare, seeing clients coming in and out who were in detention, and just hearing the judge give them chance after chance after chance, where you have a Black boy right here who gets one opportunity. He does one thing, it's straight, he's being committed. And the policies and the language that's used often, the way that they use the language and the way that they choose their words to talk about our Black youth is just really problematic. And no, like, it's just not a conversation that's not happening enough. Of course, amongst other like Black social workers, we're having these conversations, but on a higher level, no one's talking about it. And even in foster care, when you look at policies for who can become a foster parent, let's just start there. That's problematic. You need to make a certain amount of money. We have racial inequity. So who typically gets approved to be a placement? And then when you look at kinship placements, that's also an issue, because, you know, there may be barrier crimes in the state of Virginia. The list of barrier crimes are stricter than in Florida, than the federal, not Florida, but the federal standard is stricter in Virginia. And so when you look at, you know, who's affected the most by the criminal justice system, what population, and then you see their crimes, and then you look at the list, and it's like, now this family member can't be a placement because of XYZ. And even it goes to social worker, their own bias, because it's like, oh, I don't want to place them there because XYZ. They find some excuse that fits within the policies. Whereas I know that the kid would probably be a best fit here than staying with the family who's white, who does not care about their culture, who's not interested and figuring out how they can help them still be a part of their culture while they go through this traumatic process. And so I think when we look at the policies in that realm, foster care and juvenile justice, and how it just trickles down from leadership all the way down to the worker and how they engage with the youth, it's just so like overwhelming. Like sometimes I'm just like, how did I get here? Like, this is not what I signed up for. Like, I signed up to do real work, and it feels like I'm not only helping my clients, but I'm fighting this system and still trying to like protect my own self and fight the aggression. Like, it's just, before I get on a tangent, it's ridiculous.
Thank you, Brianna, for reminding us of the historical context, because it's the history that then perpetuates all these other inequities, right? That, you know, that we see with adolescents, we see with Black and Indigenous people in, you know, when they're seeking services, we see that, and it comes from what you're pointing out, the, it stems from, the context, the historical context of racism.
Yes,
So,
thank you. Thank you. Also,
Notion
Brianna.
has had her hand
Yes.
up for a while.
Notion, yes.
Thank you. Really, everyone that's gone so far has said so many powerful things. And what I was reminded of is an instance where last week, so I work in a group that works with Harlem. And right now a researcher came up to us saying, well, with the new vaccine coming up, we wanted to work with the Black community there and use psychoeducation to teach them about the importance of the virus without recognizing the historical trauma that the Black community and Brown communities in general have experienced. Henrietta Lacks, and then the birth pills with Puerto Rican women and them being sterilized. Medicine has been so traumatic. And for white social work research to come to us and tell us we're going to be using a psychoeducation focused group to teach the Black community why the vaccine is so important without acknowledging any of the racism, and then weaponizing her tears when we tell her that this is racist. You're not seeing what we're trying to tell you to do. You're not listening to our words. You just came for our validation because we're a group that works with the Harlem community. And if we don't agree with you, you're going to weaponize your tears and tell us that we're not hearing her. And then having to navigate all of that in a professional setting has been so frustrating. And then having them gaslight you and then still try to be professional because that's what you're expected to do, be professional, or else, you're the one that's being rude and offensive, and then constantly trying to balance that professionalism, maintaining work relationships, but then handling all this aggression and racism, and then trying not to appear sensitive is something that I feel like a lot of us experience often. It's something as a student I've experienced really often, and as an emerging practicing social worker, I see it. And I'm only 2 years into my profession, so I can't even imagine how everyone is doing it the entire time and how I'm supposed to learn and navigate these conversations. And it's handling the gaslighting, especially in a professional setting, and when they use evidence-based practices to validate their ideas, when evidence-based practices rooted in racist academia, where they won't look at community practices because a lot of people don't have access to education. Their practice isn't validated because it's not in academia. So you only can look towards evidence-based practices, which is monopolized and gatekept by academia. So, the intersection between clinical social work and academia and then professionalism and just handling all of that is really stressful sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you, Notion. I mean, you're talking about the mistrust of the system, of the healthcare, Western, medical model. And, that stems from, a history of slavery, right? For, African-American people, where there was like mutilated bodies, whether we're talking about the Tuskegee study, right? There's a mistrust, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for the mistrust. And so, and here you are, trying to point out, just give information, and then getting the backlash and the weaponization of the tears, you know, is really disheartening. Because, you know, you're trying to move on the conversation, you know, to help the organization understand, you know, what this is and how to go about addressing the situation so that we can provide an equitable, you know, service. So it's, to me, I get very emotional. It's hard. It's very, very hard doing this work.
Thank you. Notion, thank you. You spoke to so much. You spoke to so much, and thank you just for everything that you spoke to. I think it relates back to so many of the previous town halls that we've had in social work education and social work, you know, NASW, you know, as a chapter. And so we're seeing these trends. One of the things that's coming up for me, well, I can say a lot here with what you just said, but I want to highlight something that came up before. Weaponizing tears, dealing with gaslighting, right? So I want to highlight that as Black and brown social workers, that's emotional labor that we are called to do in our jobs that white social workers do not have to deal with. That's just putting that out there. That is emotional labor. And so what we're speaking to, it's not just what we're seeing in systems and practice, we're experiencing it. We take it home, we experience it, and we feel it on a physical, bodily level. The other thing that I want to talk about is what you're highlighting is, you know, weaponizing, when we weaponize, you know, particular people's emotions, and how certain people's emotions get privileged, but also how other people's emotions get silenced. So that gets into, as Eddie spoke to, whiteness and white fragility. So white fragility, we're speaking somewhat to what happens in organizations when white people feel uncomfortable in certain conversations about race, and where it becomes about catering to, you know, somebody said in the chat, catering to comfort over Black liberation. So Black liberation is minimized. We can't go there yet, or we can go there when everybody's comfortable. And when we say when everybody's comfortable, we mean when white people are comfortable. And so I'm just acknowledging that because that's real. It happens in these settings, and it happens in dialogue. Anytime you have a dialogue about race, it comes up. And it goes back to Eddie's point about whiteness. This is whiteness. This is how whiteness shows up in individual conversations, how whiteness shows up in organizations. So thank you. And I just wanted to highlight that. White Fragility, I actually just finished the book by Robin DiAngelo. If you haven't read it, I do suggest it. It is a really good book, really enlightening. And it speaks a lot to what we're dealing with, and the gaslighting and feeling like, well, my feelings are invalidated because I have to make sure that other people are comfortable before we can talk about anything else. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, let's just keep this going. Thank you. Caroline, Eddie, is that your hand up again?
Yeah, I was.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think another thing that, and again, for like my white counterparts who are in the room, another thing to be cognizant of is like conditional allyship. This is one of the things that I've noticed very commonly. And actually, like when we were advocating for this new course at our institution, the chairs people really started seeking validation, or what I call it seeking a trophy. Like, well, we're doing this and we're doing this, and not all of our professors are bad, but some of them are. And I think it's important to remember that conditional allyship is also part of the problem. When you're really doing this work and you're ingrained and in the trenches with us, allyship only goes so far. So many of us are looking for accomplices in disrupting and dismantling this oppression. You know, we have to really get to the point in that work, and this goes for myself, you know, me being on the spectrum of being lighter, right? I have been conditioned to be anti-Black. I'm from the South. I'm an Afro-descendant, but that doesn't mean that I am Black. Like, I can't walk into a room and say that I have the exact same experiences as my Black counterparts in this room. I may be a person of color, but I don't have that experience. So I had to even get to the point in my work where I was like, I don't need a trophy from y'all. I may get my feelings hurt, because I benefit from certain things, but I shouldn't have to constantly be like, well, I'm doing this work, and what about me? Or, you know, what about the white professors that said we're making this affinity group for y'all? In those moments, it perpetuates that white saviorism. And I think that that's another thing to really think about, especially if you're in positions of power, because we oftentimes default back to, again, that comfort. Like, let's buffer this discomfort by saying we have some good white folk on staff. So let's shift the narrative to that.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank
may
you.
I jump in?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, apologies for being off camera. I'm on my phone and taking a self-care walk around my neighborhood.
No worries.
So yeah, I just really appreciate this, first of all, that you're holding this space and having this discussion and centering the voices of BIPOC folk. And so much that's been said, I just really resonate with. I am a social work educator here in Colorado, but I'm a Jersey girl. And God, I miss home. Talk about whiteness, I'm surrounded by it. And the thing I'm struggling with is and I lead our Latinx certificate at DU, is everything that we teach is in the white paradigm, as Jessica was saying, and as Eddie has commented on as well. I think if we really want to make change, we have to live into being the disruptors that I think we're called to be. We need to radically revolutionize the way we teach social work and have a higher standard for what it takes to be certified as a social worker. Some of the best social workers, as I say that, don't have a degree actually, because they come from the communities that are impacted. So I really struggle with white saviorism in particular. So it's not just the ignorant racists, though we also graduate those, unfortunately. It's also the do-gooders. And not just white folks, but also folks of color. You know, people come into the profession, everybody's got the nice heart that wants to do good in the world. Well, who the fuck are you? Who am I to be doing good? Right? It's this power over dynamic that's inherent in the white framework that we work in. It's still, even though we say it's not, it's still this kind of either charity model or pathologizing medical model. And because it doesn't come from us, these are not our sources of wisdom other than what they've, appropriated and whitewashed. We need to move away from these destructive paradigms that cause us to be complicit in harming our communities. I think of Paul Kivel and the buffer zone that he talks about, and how so often we're the good cops, right? And now they're talking about defunding the police and they want to replace the police with social workers. We can do just as much damage without guns, and we do. So I think there's two things that I'm really interested in working with folks to think through and to disrupt. And that's one, questioning and learning how to figure out how to dismantle the white paradigms that we work in and that we continue to teach in. And two, we all have racialized healing to do. I highly recommend the book, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. All of us in this country have been impacted and have racialized trauma. And he talks about, for white folks in particular, it's going to take 3 to 10 years of doing serious work on yourself, and not just with yourself, in community, with accountability, to see yourself, to know what you're doing before you can have a good impact, possibly less harmful impact in working cross-culturally with others. I'm mad as hell. I'm past just standing on the sidelines, and I risk my own job and my neck all the time in speaking out. And I've had to silence myself a bit more because my voice is not always welcome in faculty circles, even amongst faculty of color, because I'm being too radical. I welcome any feedback on what I've shared. And thank you so much again for this series.
Yes, thank you, Lorena. Is that how you pronounce your name? Yes, being a disruptor. I mean, you're talking about the fact that cultural competence is not enough. Having an understanding of, you know, the legacy of racism, of power, privilege, difference, you know, having the understanding that the mistrust that's gone on within the healthcare system. You also touched on the point that, you know, for our white counterparts, the requirement for self-inventory to be able to do that work. If we're talking to our clients about sexual abuse, domestic violence, self-harm, suicidality, we should also be able to talk about race-based stress, racism, and how that, you know, contextualizes everything. The, the lived-in experience of our clients of color. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes, thank you, Lorena, thank you. I want to acknowledge that we did have some other hands go up, so I want to make sure that we also have a space for other folks to speak. This is just so great, so much richness here.
And
Sandra,
we haven't even got off to our second question. We're like, you know,
this is why we have another session. And I knew this was going to happen, and it's totally fine. I want to, Sandra. I saw Sandra's hand up.
Real quick?
Excuse me?
There was someone within the chat that was feeling attacked, and I wanted to address that, Joanne Connors, because I don't want anyone to come in here feeling attacked, but this is why this is uncomfortable. And that's what I just want to make sure that people understand. Coming in to understand what African-American people, what people of Indigenous descent, and all of that are going through is something that we have not talked about. And that's why it's so uncomfortable. And it could be taken offensive because you haven't had to deal with that and you're just now hearing that. But nobody is trying to attack anyone who is not of the same race or culture, but we're trying to get understanding so that we can truly walk hand in hand, toe to toe, and defeat this racism in our country so that we can all work together to truly be one. So I just wanted to say that because I did not want her to feel that this is an attack. This is a way to grow.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Can
Thank
I
you,
just say
Stephanie.
something real quick?
Thank you.
I really apologize.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much for noting that, for highlighting that, for naming that. And I do encourage, as I said in the beginning, as we show up to this in very different spaces. And so as you're experiencing this conversation, however you're positioned in society, however you're positioned, this is going to be triggering. And so I encourage you, as I said in the beginning, to learn. Part of learning how to engage in this dialogue is to learn how to tolerate some of that discomfort, to be able to understand where it's coming from, what's coming up, what are the feelings that are coming up for us. That's also important part of the work. And it's going to be triggering. So thank you, Stephanie, for naming that. And I just want to name that again, that this, yeah. Part of the work is being able to learn how to lean into the discomfort and see what it means for us. Jenny, I see you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to jump in real quick, especially I loved Eddie, and then Miss Lorena was talking about as a professor. One of the things that I do is I disrupt. I just take a lot of joy in that because I have the privilege and I think a responsibility to very young up and coming social workers. We unpack white privilege like no other. I work at a university where traditionally that would not have happened. I don't ask a lot of permission to do some things because, as she said, it's framed in such a way with the books that we use. But you have to go outside of that. You have to disrupt. You have to talk about it. I have to get my students to be uncomfortable. They are very uncomfortable. And that's when I know they're growing. I mean, I did not have the privilege of having those discussions. I love the idea that we can bring it to the classroom now. We can talk about, I go historically, I go 400 plus years wide with racism across the board and all of that and how it's impacted social work. So she's right, we have got to disrupt it. We've got to be part of the research. We've got to be part of the textbooks, which we are not. We've got to get in there and we've got to write it. And so, you know, I challenge my students. I challenge myself. I'm like, okay, this needs to go down as education material. We've got to put it out there. It needs to be brought to where it's in the university's faces. You got to talk about it. You have to. So disruption, that's kind of what I'm good at.
Okay, so
Love it. Thank you, Jenny. And Caroline, I did see we have some other hands up, and I want to make sure that we take the time to.
I think you said Sandra.
Yes, Sandra. Yes.
Yes, that's me. Okay, right.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay,
yes, go ahead, Sandra.
Thank you so very much. I'm probably coming from a slightly different perspective. I put my mask on because I broke my tooth, but I'm going to take it off. I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. After 40 years, I just retired from social work, working as a social worker. 40 years. I work with children, elderly, juvenile, drug and alcohol. I've been in administration, adjunct faculty member at the University of Alabama. 40 years. This is what I want to say. Many, many social workers have no clue of systematic racism, nor emotional labels, privilege, non-privilege, many, many other things that I can say. Of course, after working 40 years, I've seen a lot. I've come home with many, many tears, oftentimes. Even in administration, I've been at the big table with 10 males. I was the only female and the only African American. But I stood my ground because of my clients.
Mm-hmm.
When I could not get the system to understand, I still spoke up. What I began to do, I came to understanding and realizing that as a social worker, I was there for my client. So I began to fight individual battles. And I'm pleased to say, and won many. I myself took a test. Well, maybe I should say an assessment. And discovered after 40 years of social work that I came from a privileged background. I didn't realize it, but I did. I took the assessment, scored almost 90% of privilege, being privileged. What I want every social worker to hear me say, never give up.
I look back at 40 years and I asked myself, did anything change because of me? Did anything get better for for any client because of me? Did my environments get better because of me? In other words, I wanted to know, had I made a difference with my clients and individuals after 40 years of working? So despite what you see, what you feel, what you touch, what you can't change, never give up. Somebody out there needs you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Wow.
so much, Sandra. I mean, yeah, that's why we're in this work together. That's why we're having these difficult conversations. It's because we love this profession and we want to revolutionize this profession. We want it to be better. We want it to meet the needs of all our clients.
Yes, yes, thank you. Oh, that was just so moving and so powerful. Just gave me chills. Thank you, Sandra. I am mindful of the time, and I'm also mindful that there were folks who had their hand up, and I want to make sure that we get to them. I also saw Atticus.
Hi, I was just thinking a little bit about institutions and how they legitimize themselves as a nonprofit amongst other nonprofits. And I'm mixed. My dad is Syrian and my mom is white. And I have noticed in my professional life that nonprofits tend to use me to fill spaces that are, then they have filled a quota for so then they have a person of color and then they don't need to tokenism. Yeah, that is the word I'm looking for. Thank you, Wendy. So then they don't need to fill that space with a darker skinned person. And it's just something I've noticed as I've been working as a professional. And then they expect me to lead like a diversity, equity, and inclusion effort, but they don't provide any support in that effort. And then they will be, when nothing comes of it, they will say, well, I guess no one needs that or wanted that. And then the effort ends. And then no one else is supported. The other people of color in or Black, Indigenous people in the company are supported as well. And then it like falls on us that doesn't continue. So that's just what I have experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Atticus. We don't need lip service.
Yeah. Just had a conversation today with a colleague about tokenism and how, unfortunately, too many times we're hired to serve a particular purpose and then don't receive the support in order to actually make change. So thank you for speaking to that. Want to acknowledge that we had a couple of other hands up, Takia. And then I also see you, Eddie.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm a Black woman social worker, and I'm from Boston. I really appreciate this town hall and conversation with you all tonight. And I work in my community here, and primarily with Black girls and women as it relates to mental health and trauma and our ability to thrive. I wanted to bring the conversation back to our identities and ask the question, what other identities besides Black folk are consistently lumped together with other people and their identities? I feel like in this field, as it is today, and when an identity is not specified, it's typically understood that it will be a mostly white space. And we have got to stop normalizing white supremacy culture in this field, because when we do, we are a large part of the problem, and we need to accept responsibility for that. Finally, I also want to mention the book, My Grandmother's Hands, that was introduced earlier, is phenomenal, but the reality of where we are as a profession collectively requires white people to start interrogating their own racial identity development, which they don't often even realize they have. And they should probably begin with the book, Race is a Nice Thing to Have by Dr. Janet Helms. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Takia. Powerful.
Yes.
Spot
And
on.
someone just reached out in the chat. They didn't have their hand function. Shadiqua?
Yes. So something actionable that I think the NSJW can do surrounding education and practice would be to implement blind removal meetings. So I heard about it through Jessica Price, and she said it was actually implemented in Nassau County in New York. And so basically from her, it's like older research, but it showed that Black children are actually, like the population of Black children is double that the population of Black children in foster care is double that of Black children in America. And even more striking than that, when they did these blind meetings, the child removal rate went from 57% to 21%. So what practitioners are doing when they say, oh, hey, a child needs to be removed, they're adding all this like demographic information that lets you know, like basically poor Black single mother from the hood, and you automatically say, hey, let's take that child away. But after you take away all that information, the children are actually get to stay with their family, and the family gets services. So if we actually teach that method as social work instead of just letting the agencies decide, I think that's revolutionary in itself. Also, I wanted to say there needs to be more comprehensive mentorship for Black students who want to go into education, like being tenured professors or just administrative roles. And something else with the NASW, for Black students or just students in general, even though we have a reduced rate, I think we could also work on reducing that for Black BIPOC students. So that's just what I wanted to put out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shadiqua. Eddie, I see your hand.
Yeah, I took some, I have to go back a little bit. But I think to tie it all together, it really comes down to us understanding in what way do common defense mechanisms do white individuals use to reduce racial stress? Because that's what I noticed in the chat, right? Like shielding is a very common one. I have a Black child, I have a Black husband, or, I fight for you every day. These are shields. And in cinema, we call like these kind of connotations to like the sacrificial Negro, where you will use somebody who is Black or brown as a way of sacrificing their comfort or their liberation so that you can feel more comfortable. Or, we call it like the mystical Negro, which I think to a colleague earlier who spoke about the nonprofit, right? Using people to come into places to just take up space so that they can appear to be of service, but really they're just maintaining a white space. And I think that, when we talk about this, we also have to understand that a lot of Black and brown social workers burn out very quickly. And apart from the burnout, we die quicker because of weathering. So it's like no matter what space we go into, our race-induced stress is on a constant high. And even just understanding that, hey, me using you as a shield so that I can feel more comfortable perpetuates that racial trauma for us. So I think like a word of advice to my white counterparts is start to begin acknowledging what your triggers are and defense mechanisms are whenever you start to be confronted with racial stress that makes you reflect on your own unearned privileges or even your earned privileges, so that you can start to really become cognizant of that. And then the other thing is, you know, thinking about like the industrial nonprofit complex. That's a huge problem within our profession. And especially in predominantly, you know, IBB POC spaces. You know, I call this a pigmentocracy, right? When you have a space that's predominantly of color, but we still censor those who are closer to the proximity of whiteness in administrative roles and whatever the case may be. So that way we can maintain the status quo. So I think we also have to, again, shift our conversation and navigate it to that way as well, because again, talking about shielding, in a lot of my classes, I hear all the time, I can't be racist, I'm Dominican. I can't be racist, I am Puerto Rican. But the minute that you can, you're calling somebody's hair bad, you're calling somebody's skin horrible. You know, we have to really look at the whole picture and understand, again, if we are in a pigmentocratic kind of situation, how are you perpetuating white oppressorship? How are you shielding your discomfort by using, you know, Black and brown people or indigenous people? Like, I mean, there's no like set answer. This is hard. This is hard work. But to that point, to circle back, it comes down to conditional allyship, right? Like saying, I fight for you every day, you're seeking validation in that moment. You're seeking a trophy. And I think it's gotten to the point where Black and brown people are saying, we don't need your allyship. If it comes with a condition, and if you feel more comfortable with us riding the bus but not driving it, then you really aren't an ally. You're not an ally yet. And I know that that's uncomfortable and hurtful to hear, but it is the truth. Because let me tell you, before I got to this space of consciousness, trust me, being raised in Kissimmee, Florida, I was racist. Because we're taught to be. If you are not Black, you are inherently conditioned to be racist and anti-Black, from our media to every aspect of the way that we navigate this world. And so, you know, Joanne and whoever else in the comments, I just want to say this: you are a very good student in learning how not to see racism. And now we're at a point where you are learning to unsee that and unlearn that. And this is the work where you can be an even better student, because it's going to benefit the collective society.
Thank you. Thank you. You know,
Eddie.
when we're colorblind, we're invalidating the experiences of BIPOC people. You know, it doesn't exist. I mean, if you're colorblind, you don't see the experience. And so and the shield, when you talk about the shield, how that really kind of takes away the humanity of that individual person, you know, using their voice to express something that's very, very real. And it just silences and it hurts and it's painful. It's painful. But thank you, Eddie, for pointing out that it's a process. It's hard work. It's a deep dive and it's a process.
Eddie, what a way to close us out. Thank you. And I want to highlight something. You know, this space, I'm glad to see what happened in the chat, because to me, this is real dialogue, right? When people are engaging at a level where they're becoming somewhat triggered and, you know, putting things in the chat, that's dialogue, that things are happening, right? And it also speaks to, we all have work to do. This is not, you know, we all have work to do. We are all part of a system. We are all conditioned to not see race. We're all conditioned to be professional, which we know what professional means. And so we all have work to do. However we're situated in society, it looks different for different people, how you're situated. But We all have work to do. And so this space is a way to uplift narratives and voices that traditionally have been silenced. But at the same time, it's not that, well, some people just can't be part of this. No, we need everybody, but everybody has a different role to play. And so I encourage us, if you're coming in and you want to play a certain role, it's like, oh no, I need to step back. Encourage you to lean into those feelings, as Eddie said, but also understand and think about, okay, what is the opportunity here? What is the role that I can play here? That's our job for all of us. And again, I just want to highlight something that Sandra said in her just wonderful, powerful speech that she gave about her experience. That, after years seeing the ways she was still benefiting from privilege. And so that is just mindful for me of the ways in which we all have unpacking to do. And so this space is a way to unpack. This space is a way to uplift. And this space is a way for us to grow. And again, as I mentioned last time, this happens in community. It happens with dialogue. And so we are learning how to engage in dialogue. I wish I would have had more opportunities like this in social work education. I didn't. My classes didn't prepare me to have this conversation. But here we are, we're having this conversation, and it's way past time to have it. So just want to say thank you all. We will be having a second town hall related to this topic coming up in January. We're going to continue, so look out for town halls coming up 2021. Oh my gosh, it's hard to believe 2020 is almost over. Good riddance 2020. 2021, we're going to have more, and we're going to be continuing with this topic, really looking at what happens in clinical practice settings so much, and really moving towards, okay, how can we make these actionable goals? How can we move this forward so that we move from conversation and dialogue, which is important, to action? What are we going to do? But the dialogue is important. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for participating, and thank you for sitting with discomfort as it comes up. Thank you for staying with the process. I'm honored to be part of this. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. See you in 2021.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you for presenting
Thank you.
that information. Thank you so much.
UK.
Thank you.
Thank you
Shout
everyone
out
for
to
joining us.
UK.
Thank you so
You're
much.
up late,
Thank you
UK.
so